Hello. These are things that I've never talked about before. I'm quite excited by this. This is what we're going to be talking about in about 15 minutes' time, are both science and science fiction and unthinkable ideas. And one thing that fascinates me as someone, I was born in 1969, and I think of things which now are just run-of-the-mill, almost banal, and that I no longer think of as the magic of the future. You still have people kind of saying, you know, whatever happened to the flying cars, as if that was the pinnacle of achievement. And yet we have so many remarkable things. I'm going to show you a quick clip. This is from Tomorrow's World in 1994, and an idea that the way it's presented seems quite alien, but this is, you know, 21 years ago. And already a modem, something that is archaic to us now, the floppy disk. Something. How many people here ever had a Psion organizer? This brilliant thing, which an amazing achievement where it could remember many, many different things until you changed the batteries and forgot them due to a design fault they never admitted to. So all of these, in its own way, and I hate to use this term because I know it's used far too often, but the idea of science fiction to a 9 or 10-year-old being that gateway drug, if necessary, to finding out about the possible realities, and also finding out about doubt in the universe. And to see the way that these two ideas can mix, I think is fascinating. Like we were talking, some of the things we're going to talk about with the panel as well, which is now the use of science advisors in films. And this year alone, we've seen, at the end of last year, we had Interstellar, and then real science, Imitation Game, and Theory of Everything. Though, strange enough, Interstellar, a fiction, had more science than actually the Imitation Game or Theory of Everything, because there seemed to be a certain amount of fear about that. I did a panel in LA with Sean Carroll, who wrote an excellent book called Particle at the End of the Universe, which I would highly recommend. And he has been a science advisor on many films, including a science advisor on Thor. And I said to him, Thor, why do you need a science? And he looked a bit annoyed that I'd asked him that. Well, what do you mean, why do you? I said, well, you know, it's about, as far as I'm concerned, you know, I'm sure there may well be some people here who are worshippers of Norse gods, but I'm one of those kind of at least agnostic towards Odin and his offspring. And I said, you know, it's a mythical kind of god, isn't it? And he went, yes. But the producers of the film wanted the wormhole that the gods of Asgard came through to be as authentic as possible, which I found delightful. And then I think also of people that I've worked with on the radio show. I do a radio show called The Infinite Monkey Cage, and on that show, seeing people who have been inspired, again, initially not necessarily by science fact. We had Brian Blessed on our show, and Brian Blessed is a tremendously passionate person, again, in fact, linked to Flash Gordon as well. And he's the one who said, Gordon's alive. And when his first question, sitting on the panel, Brian Cox turns to Brian Blessed, and who is, by the way, Brian Blessed is always Brian Blessed. There's no, if you think he kind of turns it on for the camera or the microphones, he doesn't. Brian Blessed is Brian Blessed 24/7. Brian Cox turned and just said, Brian, how do you feel about intergalactic space travel? And Brian Blessed just looked at us furiously and went, I've always wanted to go to Mars! Why can't we go to Mars? Tell me, Brian, tell me, why aren't we on Mars? He said, I don't know, I'm not really involved. And he went, well, get involved for fuck's sake. But then when we were sitting with him afterwards, he wasn't putting that on. He actually looked quite tearful. He said, when I was 7 years old, I saw a film and it had Mars in it, and I thought, I want to go there. Why aren't we there? So what is it that, as we see the build-up of because I think at the moment we are going through a good age for public fascination in scientific ideas, again, both through fiction and fact. And this, I suppose, if we go back, it started, there was a man, let's see what my next clip, right there, that Amazing Stories, there we are, which is Hugo Gernsback, who was the Hugo Awards, the famous science fiction awards, are named after him. And he was desperate to use fiction, like these beautiful covers there from Amazing Stories. Tragically, most of them have actually been destroyed, and they only exist now. The original artwork has all gone. Those images, he wanted to inspire a generation of children to go, this sounds so fascinating that I want to explore this idea. I'm going to get somewhere here I've got a card where actually I've got the quote, and I'm just going to, it's a wonderful quote, which is basically the things that will be cold fact tomorrow. That was his idea. He said today, imagined fantasy, tomorrow, cold fact. And we slowly see amongst science fiction writers as well, people like Isaac Asimov, for instance. Isaac Asimov was someone who started off in the world of science fiction, fascinated, of course, with robots, the 3 laws of robotics, but even things like robots, that to me is a beautiful thing. The fact that the term robot is a very recent term. Carol Capet came up with the term robot, RUR, and that is now just, that was a title for a fiction. And now, robots, there is a reality to that. And in fact, I'm going to end by showing you a walking robot if I've got time, which is one of my favourite things and which is quite discombobulating. But Isaac Asimov, he actually wrote, here we have, this is Dangerous Visions, a book that I'd highly recommend. This is the first part of the collection, put together by Asimov and predominantly Harlan Ellison. And we see this little changeover where this man, Isaac Asimov, who was writing fictions then, most of his work actually was science fact. And he talks here, this would have been 1967. Today, on the very day that I write this, I receive a phone call from the New York Times. They are taking on an article I mailed them 3 days ago. The subject, the colonization of the moon. And they thanked me. Leaping lunar, how times have changed. 30 years ago when I started writing science fiction, I was very young at the time, the colonization of the moon was strictly a subject for pulp magazines with garish covers. It wasn't, don't tell me you believe all that junk literature. That's all it was considered to be, just pulp. It was, don't fill your mind with all that mush literature. Most of all, it was escape literature. But now we are living in that time of escape. Arthur C. Clarke being another example of someone who, when he was a young man, part of the Interplanetary Society in the 1930s, imagining what it would take to go to the moon. And then Arthur C. Clarke, of course, writing stories that included the story that led to Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, one of the greatest films. That is the introduction, by the way, to Amazing Stories, where a lovely description by Hugo Gernsback when he says, this is not going to be one of those magazines of mere romance and other such slush. This is one of the adventure type, but beyond the adventure type. We will intermingle it with scientific facts and prophetic vision. This will be scientifiction, which it turns out was quite a clumsy term and is no use belonged by Waterstones. So this is, and then also we had things like this, Dan Dare. Dan Dare was the image of the 1950s of us going into space. In the 1970s, we went for a slightly more dystopian vision when fascism started to be more fashionable amongst the 8-year-olds of 1977 with Judge Dredd. But again, Judge Dredd, one of the important things that 2000 AD led to was giving work to that man there, Alan Moore. Alan Moore, again, the wonderful thing, I'll tell you a few things. Alan Moore, who in terms of predicting a dystopian future, you might have seen David Cameron, I think 2 weeks ago, said, for too long we've been a passively tolerant society, merely saying to our population that we'll leave you alone as long as you obey the law. It turns out that's not been enough. And when I told that to Alan Moore, he went, if I'd put that in V for Vendetta, they would have said, Alan, you're over-egging the pudding. And there is this beautiful thing where Alan loves scientific ideas, but he writes fiction. His current book that he's just finished, his novel, Jerusalem, is longer than the Bible. And he says the reason he's made it so long is so only the strongest can critique him. And his work, we once did a panel, there was him and Brian Greene, author of The Elegant Universe, amongst other things, and Alan was just talking about some of the stories he'd done for Future Shocks in 2000 AD, and he talked about these ideas, I had a planet that was so massive that it actually, it bent time itself. And I realised that was just me mucking around with ideas, and it was a bit silly. And Brian Greene kind of stopped and went, actually, that could be what would happen. That would be right. And then Alan went through a couple more ideas of him just dicking around in stories. And each time, Brian Greene went, no, that would be correct as well. That was probably what we currently think would happen. And by the end of the session, Alan went, I had no idea, but I am, in fact, a genius. But his ideas, again, they were the way that I got into a lot of fascinating ideas. Yeah, this beautiful thing of my first entry into ideas of quantum mechanics, of quantum cosmology, of, again, this universe of doubt. Rather beautiful description by a man called John Higgs, who's just written a book about the 20th century called Stranger Than We Can Imagine, where he talks about living in a quantum universe. And he said, it's like imagining something is both a brick and a song, which I thought is one of the most beautiful descriptions of wave-particle duality. And so now we are living in this universe with doubt, and we can be playful. And as I said, the quantum ideas, these are, you know, it was Douglas Adams. I was reading books by Douglas Adams. I was reading cartoon strips by Alan Moore. And the strange thing is, originally it was science fiction that got me into science fact. It was, as I said, Battle Beyond the Stars and the like that got me watching Carl Sagan's Cosmos and more David Attenborough documentaries. And then it was as an adult, having no longer really being into science, I went off science when I was 13 years old in a physics lesson, holding a burning peanut under a test tube filled with water to find out the energy that lay within the peanut. That was at that point that my kind of romantic entanglement with cosmology cooled. And then it was when I got back into science that after a few years I realised that actually science fiction was fascinating. The ideas of Philip K. Dick, the, again, frequent dystopian visions but also utopian visions. All of these things that to be playful with ideas, to avoid dogma. Now, I mentioned Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov was on various panels, including a panel that was, as I mentioned, advising on the moon. Arthur C. Clarke was involved in 2004 on a panel looking into terraforming Mars. And Robert Heinlein, the famous writer Stranger in a Strange Land and many others. Robert Heinlein was on a panel that was put together during the Reagan administration, which looked at the, well, amongst other things, the defense initiative, which became known as Star Wars. So that was how we were going to save ourselves in the future. And by the way, it didn't really work out, in case you're wondering if that's going on up there now. And it reminds me of the think of mutually assured destruction. One, the fact that we are actually in a very dystopian vision of the future. Sheffield, for those of you old enough, one of the most haunting things that I saw as a teenager was Threads, where we saw Sheffield destroyed in a nuclear war. Carl Sagan, of course, famously said that wonderful line about the nuclear arms build-up. It's like two men up to their waists in petrol, one with 5 matches and one with 7. This is James Lovelock in a wonderful series in which various different scientists chose what they consider to be their 7 wonders of the world. One of the ones that he chose was standing up, the ability of human beings to stand up and walk, and the difficulty of that. So that was 1997. Reasonably confident about that. Let's have a look at 2012. And I'm still suspicious. I look and I think, is there any way someone small could fit in there? All of these things, I think, the starting point for so many of these ideas is actually in toying around with the ideas, in dicking around with ideas, in ideas where you just sometimes go, I'm going to sit down and I'm just going to, I mean, one of my favourite things that I've ever seen was we once did a panel with Alan Moore and Brian Cox. And Alan Moore, I haven't mentioned, is a self-declared wizard. And we started arguing about ideas of consciousness. Of course, again, neuroscience, we are finding out incredible things, and we're still, again, at the very beginning, really, of a long journey. That is part of the beauty of this. It is, again, going back to that doubt, going back to the fact that what we are hoping to do is constantly come up with less wrong answers, but not then going, well, this is totally right. It's coming up with the least wrong version of events. And so Alan was talking about the idea that the inner monologue 3,500 years ago, according to Julian Jaynes and some others, he believes that human beings did not realise that their inner monologue was their inner monologue. They might have believed it was a deity or some outside agency. They did not realise that what they heard was possessed by themselves and created by themselves. And we have this beautiful argument that went back and forth, because Brian doesn't really like that kind of idea. He likes physics, and this was just too far from physics. And we went back and forth, and every time that Brian went, but I don't really think, Alan would go, let me continue and tell you about Homer's Iliad. And this went back and forth for 15 minutes, and eventually Brian had nothing else to argue, and he had to sit in silence while Alan continued for another 10 minutes. And there are few more beautiful things to see in the world than a particle physicist beaten in an argument by a wizard. And there we go. And that was made by Christopher Sykes, who is still making documentaries now. He's made many fascinating documentaries. And is an arts graduate. So when he first met Richard Feynman, there were some issues about that. And, right, yeah, sorry. So I've never done a thing in less than like an hour and a half. So that's why I've jumped around a lot today, because I promised that I'd do it on time. And there was a great bit where Christopher Sykes, he would ask Richard Feynman questions. It's called Fun to Imagine. It's on YouTube. And you can see that because he's an arts graduate, sometimes Feynman goes, no, that's a stupid question. And there's a wonderful one, which I would highly recommend. Look up magnets, where Christopher just says, that feeling when you get a magnet, say you've got the same poles together, and there's a kind of a feeling of a force. And he goes, what do you mean? And he goes, well, I think that is a good question. And then Feynman changes and goes, you're right, it is. And again, there's that beautiful thing which They're the meeting of someone with an artistic mind and a scientific mind, and for a moment there is that friction, but then they realise they can create together. And what we hopefully know is that what great art and what great science, and even good art and good science, what they do is they change the way that you view what it is to be in the universe. They change the way that you picture the universe and what lies within. And that, I think, is what, when you see the two working together at their best, every time you see whether it's a great painting or whether you hear about a wonderful experiment, you hear about the Large Hadron Collider and that 50 years of waiting until they could turn to Peter Higgs and go, we've got results, and I'll tell you what, it was really worth waiting that amount of time. These are the kind of things that change the way that we can see ourselves and our place in the universe. So I am now going to introduce our panel. Our panel are, they're wise people, by the way. I should say I'm not wise, but I've revealed that now. I'm basically a Renaissance idiot. I've read just about enough to be wrong on everything. And so we are joined by the author of Lab Coats in Hollywood and also a senior lecturer at Manchester University, David A. Kirby. We are also joined by the science writer, Dr. Alice Bell, and we're joined by commissioning, well, one of the commissioning team at the Discovery Network, who is Tom Gorham. A round of applause. Oh, I'm not going to see that signal now. Sorry, that was probably much longer than it should have been. Let's get other people talking quickly. Alice, I thought we'll start off by talking a little bit about the real history of science before we then go into how it's been used by others, how it's been reimagined for fiction. So where do we see, what for you is the beginning of kind of science becoming part of a culture?
Oh, I think it's always been part. If anything, the question of like when science sort of split away from other bits of culture. My PhD's in kids' science books, and one of the facts I used to like to tell people when I was trying to pretend that was a serious thing to do a PhD on is that one of the first children's books in English ever was a science book about a little boy, Tom Telescope, telling his friends about the stars and about astronomy. And so it's got a long history of being part of culture, you know, sort of children's literature, books that adults would write for children from the very beginning have been about science, and not just about kind of things that we now think of as science, but are kind of just about nature or animals or the stars, but you know, scientists as a sort of professional body thinking about it in what we've now defined as a scientific way. So yeah, it's always been around. I think in terms of kind of things I could say about the history of science. The reason why I think I was asked here today was that I wrote a piece a few months ago about stories from the history of science that could be on screen. It was because, admittedly, it was a little bit of a sort of exercise in clickbait, which I will openly admit to. The Theory of Everything and The Imitation Game are both up for Oscars, and some of the people I was working with were like, "You've got to write a piece about this. We'll get lots of clicks." And I remember when I was in undergrad, my undergrad degree, my bachelor's is in history of science. And one of the games we used to play in the pub when we'd stopped trolling biologists with philosophy, which is really easy. You can't troll physicists. They just reply back to you with some more philosophy. Biologists, easy to wind up. But when we stopped winding up the biologists when they'd got cottoned on to the fact we would wind them up and they'd run away, we'd sit around and we'd imagine films from history of science, some of which have then got made. There was a film about Darwin. Did anyone see it? I've not seen
Creation.
it. Apparently it's awful. Our version had Vin Diesel playing Darwin. That's a winner. But we sit around. So I wrote this piece kind of just basically trawling through my memory of what we kind of had ideas of. And
that's a great idea, though, the Vin Diesel one, because that could be a Fast and Furious where it's Stephen Jay Gould versus Charles Darwin, punctuated equilibrium, and that's Right, who here also directs fiction? We've got a pitch for you later on.
I think I've got some slide. I've got a slide with a particularly nice image. Yeah, here we are. So Hedy Lamarr was one of the ones we came up with. Hedy Lamarr, someone's going to do an amazing biopic of her, and it will be because she was this glamorous film star, first person to do an orgasm on screen on film. Apparently she did it because she was only like 17 at the time or something, or maybe even younger. Her director put a pin in her arse so that she'd move her back in the right way to show what was meant to be an orgasm. But she ended up marrying an arms dealer who was friends with Mussolini and Hitler. It was all very complicated and kind of interesting in terms of history of 20th century. She ran away from him in this very glamorous way and ended up in Hollywood and was this glamorous Hollywood actress. She was always very bored by being an actress though, and she'd sit and invent things on set when she was hanging around on set. And one of the things she invented led to basically Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is a complex technology, it involves lots of different components, but one of the bits of that history of how we got to Wi-Fi was her, and she invented it. And so it's this lovely story of like this amazing engineer who's a woman and incredibly glamorous, and Hollywood. So that was one of the characters. From a public engagement with science and sort of women in engineering story, I'm not sure I want to celebrate this too much because I don't want women to think that they have to be as beautiful as her or married to an arms dealer before they can be a great engineer. But you know, it's a story, certainly. I think there's another slide, another image. This guy, Guy Callender, from the history of climate change. I work in climate change mainly these days, and people are always like, oh, public engagement with climate change is so difficult. I think we should just tell its history. It goes on really, it quite go quite long back, and I think if people get a better idea of how we got to why we understand it, there would be some great stories. So he's a lovely story. He's one of the people who first worked out the link between fossil fuels and climate change, and he did this in his spare time. He was an amateur meteorologist. His main job was as a railway engineer. So he was actually working in some of the machines that causes sort of climate change, and then also discovering it. So there's kind of it's sort of a lot of our kind of the tragedy of the 20th century and industrialization and science and people inventing these amazing things and then realizing that we're screwing everything up with them, and so we need to have better inventions to sort that out. There's a lot of that kind of drama captured in his story. And we were talking earlier about kind of the history of climate change research more generally in the late 20th century, and how a lot of it, the reason why we funded so much climate change research that meant we could discover things like the hole in the ozone layer or climate change happening, all sorts of other things, was that post-war a lot of government money went into funding geology and geophysics because they saw it as a kind of way of, well, they kind of turned biology into bombs, so bioweapons, and chemistry and physics, and the next step was geology. Could we turn the planet into a kind of bomb? And so a lot of this research was actually done for military reasons, and then led to the fact that we now know about climate change. But there's an interesting dramatic history there too. And finally, I've just got one other image. Sort of characters from history of science that we don't, sort of the sideline characters. There's loads of stories of women who kind of helped out in science, but there's also this guy who's Frank Oppenheimer, who's Robert Oppenheimer's little brother. If you've seen the Oppenheimer play, which I think is just finished in the Royal Shakespeare Company had on, he's a character in it. Robert Oppenheimer ran the Manhattan Project, very famous guy. His little brother has this fascinating story where he also worked on the Manhattan Project, but he got thrown out of physics post-war for having been a communist briefly in the 30s and was blackballed. So went off, their parents were quite rich, he sold his dad's a spare Picasso that his dad had left him, and bought a ranch and became a cowboy. But he couldn't stop doing physics, so he helped out in the local school teaching physics and started inventing all these new ways of teaching physics that were really interactive. And then everyone loved the way he taught physics so much, he ended up going back to a university and teaching all the other people how to teach physics. And he then got bored of that. He didn't like the way that universities had become more corporate post-war. And so he ran off and built the Exploratorium, which is a lovely museum in San Francisco of hands-on science, and the real principles of open science and trying to invoke wonder in children, which has been replicated all over the world. So if you go to any science museum the world over, you'll see the same set of exhibits that sort of are repeated, and they were all invented in San Francisco because this guy. So he had a huge impact on history of science education, and nobody ever knows about him because his big brother kind of eclipses it. So it's sideline stories too. That was where I think I've got to say about history of science.
Who was he going to be played by in your version of the film?
I don't know, there's a bit of Michael Sheen, you know. Yeah.
Maybe Matthew McConaughey could.
Yeah, sure.
Well, let's move on to Discovery Channel. While we stay on kind of factual science, when you are looking at the scientific idea, what do you feel are the elements you need for the story that will hook your audience? Because, of course, everything that Alice has just been talking about there, that all of them have wonderful stories to then also see the science.
Well, the mistake, I think, that a lot of people, not the mistake, but the biggest challenge for us is there are so many disparate, huge science ideas out there, but the way that Discovery works is it doesn't suit sort of single films that are, you know, would play on a Thursday night on Channel 4. We need to have things that will play all over the schedule. And so at the moment we're working on a series where we're taking all of those different ideas and combining them into one series, but the approach is through the scientists. So basically we've almost got a cast of characters the biggest scientists in physics, the biggest scientists in space, new movements in space exploration, and we're tying them all together almost into a soap opera. And so instead of having one Horizon style, we're off to Mars, or one Horizon style investigation into, I don't know, quantum physics, we're mashing them all up. But the poster will be the scientists instead of a picture of the rocket. And so that basically it's the human stories, the drama, the emotions, the fact that they're like, oh my God, I've got to stay here another week and, to get my rocket out into space instead of going home to the wife. And so what has always been the challenge for us is that dry, old school science. We don't want to do that anymore. So now it's looking for people like Oppenheimer's little brother, that we can really engage with and care about.
What do you think when you say dry old school science? Because I mean, Horizon, for instance, has gone through a lot of different years. There
Sure.
was a point in the late 90s where almost every one seemed to be about a panic. It was each one was certainly a lot of the ones with kind of the oncoming apocalypse. But equally, when I then watch something like I've mentioned Christopher Sykes already, that idea of just having Richard Feynman in an armchair, and this was before he was famous, this was before the books that made him the name that he was came out. That to me is still quite mesmeric. Would that be impossible to make now?
Good question. I don't know.
So what do you mean? But in terms of dry science?
Well, it's where although we're a factual channel, we're sort of entertainment is really important to us, and if you want to appeal, we play in 220 countries, 224 or something, and our audience ranges from 15-year-olds to 60-year-olds, and you can't engage everybody with your thing. I mean, it's unfair to pick on Horizon, but a sort of a UK terrestrial science doc will be focused at a very niche audience at a very specific time. We have to appeal to everybody, or at least try to appeal to everybody. So different channels have different challenges, but for us, that is the one. So we can't have a straight analysis of something. We always have to find an angle, and so the best example of something that we've been doing for the past few years to try and make science engaging, and that ties into your dreams and unthinkable things, is there are lots of amateur scientists out there, and this is a very current thing, who will shoot their own experiments. And so again, rather than following one single thing for an hour, we're combining all of these crazy experiments, like building your own submarine out of a propane tank, or jet-powered bicycles and things like that. And I've got a clip of just one guy's garage invention. But we're into series 4 of this, so we've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these really cool experiments, and it allows us to delve into physics, biology, chemistry, mechanics, engineering. And so instead of just having one really dry hour, you get endless hours, hopefully, of entertaining content. So essentially, we can really approach any number of different science things and phenomena in any different way. And so that's the real challenge, is just finding the best way at any time to sort of tap into the science, rather than trying to, like I say, every week do one subject. It's trying to gather your subjects together, and then for us, that show will play all around the world at different times of day, over months. And so we don't work in a sort of topical, fixing on one thing kind of way.
Well, we'll come back to that actually in a minute. But David, I'd get you in here as well. Now, you deal predominantly with the history of how science and fiction meet, the world of science fiction. Now, when we first talked, I went, should we talk about how now science advisors are so important, but probably during something like Destination Moon, they weren't important at all? And you went, well, they had about 50 on them. So I've been shown up already by you, but so that to me is fascinating. How long have we seen the importance of accuracy, at least to some extent, within science fiction films?
Yeah, and I should say, I was debating when I was going to sort of cut you off when you were saying this. I was like, you're wrong, but when do I tell you you're wrong?
I'm still right about Tarantula. The one about the giant tarantula had very few science advisors on it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the history of science advising, it goes back much longer than people imagine. Actually, when cinema begins in the late 19th century, 1895 is the first sort of public showing. Very soon after that, you get scientists working together with filmmakers to make films. But it's a very sort of specialized thing. You wouldn't get many who would do it. You'd find sort of isolated films in which you would have a scientist become involved in the making of a film. And it's not until I see the major use of science consultants as a post-Jurassic Park phenomenon. So in 1993, Jurassic Park comes out, very successful. They brought in a number of scientists to help them and had amazing special effects, right? The development of CGI. And Hollywood being a sort of copycat culture, realism is what sold that movie. And so they conflated scientific realism with visual realism. And so after that, you've got, anytime you had a movie with science in it, they bring scientists in because they just weren't sure if that was what was going to sell it or not. And if I was going to say a few things, if I can get my first, well, that's not the first. I was going to show a picture of my there we go. That's the first picture. Got to put in a plug for my book, I suppose, in terms of talking about this. So that's what my book was about, was looking at how scientists and filmmakers interacted, right? And I interviewed a lot of science consultants and a number of filmmakers about how they incorporated science into cinema. And, in thinking about this question, I mean, I'm an academic, right? And I'm a science communication specialist. And so I'm interested in, what we can learn from this and what this tells us about science and society. And really, for me, movies are one of the best ways to understand this interaction between science and society, right? Because movies represent the kinds of stories that people want to tell about science, right? And, like I always tell my students and whenever I give public talks, we always have to remember that there are individuals making these films, right? Someone has made very specific decisions to tell a story about science in a particular way, right? And so you can go back maybe to the other slide there. So in my particular case, when I talked to these scientists, they got involved because they wanted to influence how these stories about science were told. And so you can see an example here of a science consultant in action. In the middle is a guy named Ian Lipkin. He was the science consultant. He's at Columbia University. He's the director for their Center for Immunity and Infection. And there on your left is the director, Steven Soderbergh. So as you can see, Ian Lipkin was very heavily involved. And maybe you can go to the other slide. There on the right is the astrophysicist Kip Thorne, and he's speaking with the director Christopher Nolan for the recent film Interstellar. And one of the things when we talk about scientists becoming advisors, it's not just about scientific facts. And usually people, they say, well, what do? They must get the science right, right? But we have to dissect that notion of what is science. So when you start to think about science as more than just a collection of facts in a textbook, right? You can understand that they do a lot more when they get involved in these films than just going through the script and saying, that's right, that's wrong. So this idea of how do they influence these stories about science?
Well, can I pick up, actually, because you brought up Interstellar. Now, isn't that a film that almost exists because initially of the science, which I think, Kip Thorne, amongst others, was involved in Contact, the adaptation of the Carl Sagan book, and he was, they were disappointed. I think Andrean as well, another great science communicator, that was disappointed by the science, and they felt they could have done the science better. So there was kind of this scribbled idea. Steven Spielberg then thought there was a screenplay, rang them up and said, oh, this film sounds great. And they went, oh shit, overnight we better write up a treatment. And that's kind of the starting point. It started from trying to get the science right. So how does that change the journey of that film?
Well, it does change it, although you asked Kip Thorne if the science was right. He may not have been happy with it, but a lot of the other scientists who worked on the film were happy with it. Kip Thorne just had different ideas about the way wormholes work. And so his movie wasn't necessarily, they got the science wrong. It's like, well, they didn't use my science of wormholes to make that film. So yeah, when I was thinking about this, when I was approached, oh, you want to be on this panel, and it was sort of this idea of, well, how do these scientists sort of pitch their ideas in Hollywood? There's actually very few films where that's happened, and Interstellar is one of the few where, a scientist literally wrote something up that made its way into becoming a film. So he was central, very central in the making of this film. And he wrote the idea, the story. He was heavily involved, as you saw. I mean, Carl Sagan was heavily involved in the making of Contact until he died. I mean, he was on his deathbed, and he would ask for the dailies that were going on. He wanted to be involved, essentially, until he passed away. So yeah, when scientists are involved at the very beginning, it's a very different film, as you can imagine.
Well, we'll throw it out to the audience in a moment. I just want to, Alice, I was going to turn to you again, which is talking about climate change and how to, as you were saying, the importance of the story. There's various different, I can't forget the name now, there's an expedition which takes artists out to see Cape Farewell, takes out artists with scientists, and they see areas which seem to be have been changed by the rapidity of climate change. And I saw one event at the Edinburgh Botanic Garden where it was basically someone who had seen the change in a mollusk, the shell of a mollusk, which appeared in the fossil record to have remained pretty steady for a very long period of time. And then the last 100 years, there seems to be rapid change. And watching a mixture of the artists, what they created from that, and then the scientists explain that, seemed to be a very potent way of getting across an idea which people are swamped by, it seems. So for you, what is the way when you're trying to put together stories, what do you think is the closer you get to the art of conveying both the importance of the science and also the enthralling narrative?
Well, that example of Cape Farewell and that mollusk is really nice, because there's been a lot of work that the Wellcome Trust have put in together to get scientists working with artists on biomedicine. So they're like on health issues, which there are lots of things that can touch people very personally and can turn into all sorts of art projects or film projects or stories. But the scientists themselves, it's just one point in a lot of data, or even if they're looking at a trend across data, they're going to turn it into a paper, and it's going to become part of, they've got to turn it into science work and science words and things. And the artist can help them see it in a new way. And Wellcome does this because it means it can lead to popularising these things, because the process, it's not just the artist gets to see it and then runs off and tells the rest of the world. It's this mixture of the artist and the scientist interacting can lead to all sorts of interesting other ways of talking about it in culture, but also it influences the scientist. And Cape Farewell is one of the very few examples of projects which does that in environmental science, because there isn't a Wellcome Trust for climate change, unfortunately. To be able to do that kind of interaction. I think a lot of the scientists who work on things like sea level rises and carbon emissions and all sorts of these sort of large data sets, and they're very emotional data sets. There's an interesting project in Australia at the moment about how do you feel, asking scientists climate scientists how they feel about dealing with this work, and the kind of weight of humanity sort of spread out in these little data points. And how it's very difficult for them. And I think if they did some work with artists, it might be a way of sort of bringing that feelings out to other people so we could collectively deal with it and maybe come up with new stories around that. And I don't think there is enough work on that, would be the answer to that question, I think. But when I do with energy and climate change, there's also things to do with political stuff, and there's all sorts of drama and things like that. So, for example, my day job is doing stuff on helping popularise stories around positive actions on climate change, and one of the things we're working with at the moment is a group in Balcombe, which was the fracking village. Remember a couple of years ago everyone went and they were like, this tiny little village has got covered by all these protesters like Greenpeace, and there's Cadrilla, the frackers, and they're both spinning in different ways, and the journalists are covering it. West Sussex Police spent £4 million just dealing with the protesters, and Caroline Lucas got arrested and everything. And this little town, so then everyone left, including the frackers. They're not even fracking there, and they just got left scarred by like the future of British climate change policy just kind of played out in their tiny little village. And this group of people in the village went, right, we're going to do something positive. We're all going to work together, and we're going to cover our roofs with solar panels, and we're going to go 100% solar. I mean, there's oil used in terms of the cars and everything, but they want to produce enough solar power that would be equivalent of all the electricity they use in the town. And everyone said, oh, nice idea. And they covered some cow sheds with some solar panels, and they're going to put some solar panels on some school roofs. And last week, they just put in an application for planning permission for their own community-owned solar farm. It is a relatively small solar farm, as solar farms go, but it'll be owned by the community, not a company coming in, and it'll not only be enough, not only match the electricity demand of their village, but of one next door too. And so stories like that, I think it's a great story. Anyone want to write about that? I'm more than...
Well, I'll tell you what, there's nothing nicer than seeing a member of the commissioning team from the Discovery Channel looking at you and going, well, I think I've got something for the next meeting.
There's stories like that, and they're not the only ones. Another one up in Salford have just set up something similar. And there are stories like that of people doing positive actions on climate change. It's not just energy stuff, it's people doing community projects, counting butterflies and things. It's like, I mean, maybe you've got a similar project.
No, well, similar but different. So in that it's not climate change directly, but it's, you know, we've sort of skirted around conservation, I suppose, because Discovery is is it is an escapist brand in that, you know, people tune into Discovery to learn, but to go on a journey with us and not to sort of be brought home the realities of negative, all this negativity.
You can have the but I'm interested to know what you base that on. I presume you've done the audience research, whatever.
Yes,
but it's interesting
and you know, just it's kind of the, you know, we're there to inspire, entertain, and educate, or something like that, which generally doesn't sort of include just being too downbeat. But so the way we're tackling that at the moment is we've got a big. I think we're going to have the global, again, and this is where it really helps to have the reach that we have. You know, we've got millions and millions of viewers, possibly even topping 1 billion globally. And we've bought into a film called Racing Extinction. I don't know if you're aware of it, but basically it's focusing on the blue whale as the main subject matter. But it was inspired by, you know, by stories of dinosaurs and stuff. And basically 2 filmmakers have got hooked into whale conservation stories, but they got a sushi restaurant in Los Angeles shut down for serving whale, you know. And anyway, basically I think it's a 2-hour special that is absolutely beautiful, and they go and swim with blue whales and, you know, discuss all the science, but also the, you know, I think the current problem actually is shipping and stuff like that. But anyway, it's our way into conservation is through this epic, massive, beautiful creature, and sort of, you know, trying to have this, I don't know, it's an emotional engagement rather than a scientific, you know, a scientific study. It's an emotional engagement. And it sort of sounds like, you know, because I live quite close to Balcombe, and so, you know, I have an emotion. I mean, when we bought our house, there were no fracking traffic signs everywhere around us. But you know, it's, again, that's an emotional story. It's that, you know, we don't really care about the science so much. You know, we care more about the people and their story, surely.
There's a lot of stories. We should probably, this is something I think is partly to do with the racism of a lot of television. Maybe not the right word, but some people might disagree with it.
Diversity.
Yeah, but there is, it's that we don't talk a lot about people who are currently dealing with climate change. So if we look at sort of small island states, we don't tell those stories enough. I think the climate movement isn't very good at bringing those stories out either. These multinational NGOs that have got offices all over the world, and yet they're often led by voices in the UK or France and America, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. They're getting a bit better at that, and I think people who tell those stories too in the media could get better at that too. And there are often downbeat though. But there also are brilliant stories of people surviving, and of people coming up with these ingenious ways to survive or to change. On conservation, there's some great stories about like drones to track illegal poachers and these adventuring, daring things.
We've touched on those, and I think the new series we're doing, the character-led science, that includes some. I don't want to name any of the projects in it yet because you know, it's one of those unthinkable dreams until they actually land. Definitely, you don't know that they're going to happen. But it's a relatively recent move for us. Is to try and get into, you know, conservation, but it's just going to be picking whether it's those sort of massive events like this Racing Extinction film, you know, which is also going to be, you know, it's US and the rest of the world as well. So it will have a huge reach, but it's just working out ways, like you say, with the island nations, is, you know, what could we, you know what I mean, is it's just sort of finding a way to tie them into an engaging discovery show.
We'll throw out to the audience. I'll ask David one more question, which is, do you, having done lab coat in Hollywood, do you see within that history scientists or scientific ideas being inspired from unthinkable projects created by Hollywood or within world cinema?
Oh, unthinkable. Not necessarily unthinkable things, but you do definitely see a lot of scientists and engineers being inspired by what they see in these movies. And there are a lot of examples where they'll see something in the movies and say, well, why can't we think of it that way, and then create it off of that. So you showed Minority Report, that's chock full of those types of ideas, like the gestural interface that you see in the computers. Lots of scientists watched that and said, yeah, I want one of those. Why is that unthinkable? Why can't we have self-moving cars? And so a lot of the people who are working on self-driving cars at the moment were inspired by that film.
Is that a good idea, self-driving cars? I mean, I find it very interesting because there's a recent book. It's not The Shallows. It's another one by Nicholas Carr, where he talks about the fact that actually to then just be sitting in a car, what are you going to do? I'll read, or you take, you know, this whole. It's an interesting. Sometimes science fiction seems to offer things which, if you really think about them, will remove even more of the point of your existence and lead to existential angst.
Well, I hate driving, so I'm up for some self-driving cars. Well, the guy who was the science consultant for the Age of Ultron, the latest Avengers film, one of the things he looks at is self-driving cars because it's a related thing to artificial intelligence, right? They have to be smart enough to avoid running over people, essentially. And there's something called the trolley problem. Do people know the trolley problem? If you're on a trolley and there are people on the tracks, and it's this idea of you know, which person do you run over kind of thing. And it's an AI thing, yeah, so someone's gonna die, who's gonna die? And so this is the Age of Ultron AI type of thinking. The artificial intelligence has to even get sort of moralistic, I suppose, or think through philosophically, metaphysical. So anyway, yeah, self-driving cars, I'm up for them.
Boring, really boring.
Have we got anyone would like to ask a question out there? It's just well done. You've covered everything. The if it's we're going to run at the back. I apologise. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's going back to Tom saying that you don't really cover sort of downbeat stuff on Discovery, and I just found that a bit depressing. Ironically, yeah, I mean, you have a massive audience, but you're not wanting to kind of tackle things which are uncomfortable, I guess.
Well, it's a tricky thing because, you know, we're a pay-per-view channel, and so we're not a public service broadcaster. So our remit is to make our viewers happy, and I don't mean that in the sense of making them smile, but you know, the department I work in, the international department, like I say, we have so many different clients in so many different markets that if you start getting into too topical issues or too focused in any one kind of area, which is what these things do tend to be, then you're going to find it's just not going to succeed globally. And so our regions have the capability to make their own local content, and so that would be somewhere where they could focus more on these, you know, on subjects like that. I just think for us, when we're trying to make products that are going to play well globally, it's just too, you know, it's a bit.
Change and antibiotic resistance are both things that affect
they
everybody.
are, but they're not the sort of thing that the Discovery viewer is wanting to watch. Essentially, they might want to watch it, but on a different feed. When they come to us, they are coming to be taken away to exotic places and exciting things. It's not that we won't cover those subjects. It's just it is a really tricky one for us.
That worries. I'd be interested to know what both Robin and David think about this, because it's something that worries me a bit in the recent popular. And actually, Robin might have a really good perspective on this. It's one of the kind of like recent popularity of science, like you said earlier. I think we're living in an age of kind of wonder and and I think that's definitely true. And certainly in the UK, like public trust of science is like massively high. People like science. People really do like science. But it's maybe used because it's the bits of science that they like, and the bits of science that are being pushed to them are the kind of, hey, isn't this awesome? And there's a lot more to what scientists tell us than isn't this awesome. And also, we need to criticise science. Like this, the level of public trust in science is very high, almost worryingly so. I mean, we should also I think it behooves science media to tell stories of scientists being arseholes as well. It worries me sometimes that there's a bit too much kind of like that end of science journalism at the moment.
That's interesting, because in one way, because I think probably the trust in the US is not as high. It's very different, and then when you see the divide between the Republicans and the Democrats, it's kind of fascinating to see.
It's not that there isn't a worry.
But no, I think you're right. I think to know about but is it sometimes the battle, like with climate change, for instance, you see the body of knowledge, and again, the fact that you still have journalists, the number of journalists who write about the fact that even scientists aren't certain. It doesn't matter how many times people say, it's not about certainty, it's about coming up with this is the least wrong, this is the best version of events. We're not saying it's 100% right, but as we talked about. So is that, do you think, why people might be worried about when we show the examples of bad science, that already there's a war on, in the mass media, I think more than there is actually amongst the population. I think quite often the mass media doesn't necessarily represent what in the little way, like.
I'm not calling for loads of bad science.
Oh no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that. Do you think that might be one of the reasons why sometimes there's a resistance to that? People are so worried, or
I know why there's resistance. I understand why scientists still feel as if they're attacked. I used to spend a lot of my career kind of giving counselling for scientists, where you'd show them the public attitude surveys and go, no, really, the public do like you. And I get why they still feel like that, because particularly some very specific areas, anyone who uses animals in their experiments, or anyone in climate change, I get that. And these results differ depending on which area they're working as well. But that doesn't mean that our stories about science have to be, I don't know, it feels a bit bland if nothing else. It's all a bit like, oh, why, it's awesome.
Well, I mean, in terms of the fictional stuff, in some ways you're a little bit trapped because of the idea of certainty. You got to move the plot forward, and so things have to be a bit certain. But I think one of the worrying trends is more that it starts to become sort of mystical, that you need to sort of demystify science a little bit more. Like Thor, you mentioned, it did the, essentially you run into the old, this is so advanced, you just can't understand it, right? I think it's Arthur C. Clarke, right? Any sufficiently advanced technological civilization will be indistinguishable from magic. And I think within the fictional realm, that sort of mystification has started to creep in, where they just say, yeah, just trust it, kind of thing. And that's probably a dangerous thing to have happen.
See, I'd agree with, I think it's an interesting point where there is a belief, even though I talk about science being about the least wrong version of events, etc., that doesn't mean that all scientists are not burdened by dogma or their own presumption, and that perhaps more on that as well might be helpful, where, I know there's some scientists that I work with who just go, no, we've done the experiment, this is an objective result. You go, well, no, the way you're looking at things, I'm fascinated by ideas of reality tunnel and all of those kind of things, where to bring in some of those levels of doubt as well, and perhaps to lose some of the chivalrous ideologies of the perfection of science, when of course it is hampered also by stories of flaws and also of raging egos.
Yeah, there's people.
Oh, sorry, yes.
So I'm making. What do you think?
Hello. So thank you for everything you said so far. It's been fantastic. I want to make all those films now. Thank you. So if I'm making the Hedy Lamarr film, obviously I don't know what was going through her mind when she was sitting with her pianist housemate looking at the player piano rolls. I'm a really big fan of Hedy Lamarr. At what point does it stop being a documentary, and at what point does it become like a fictionalized biopic, where I'm imagining how she came up with the ideas or what her thoughts were if she didn't leave a record? Because there's some research I've done into other scientists where there are letters between the people trying to make a thing happen, and if you've only got one side of the letters, you have to imagine the other side. If I'm imagining what Hedy Lamarr was going through, or anybody in that situation, at what point does it stop being something, and this is a question for you too, Tom, like a docu-commission, and when does it become science fiction?
Yeah, that's. I know there was an example of a radio play not long ago on Radio 4 of, based on a fair amount of historical research on the relationship between Margaret Thatcher and one of her tutors at university. What was her name? Does anyone remember the name of the scientist who taught Margaret Thatcher, who was a massive lefty? God, what was her name? She won a Nobel Prize. The insulin woman. I can't believe I can't remember her name. Anyway, it's a nice story because she was this amazing female scientist, first woman in Oxford to get maternity leave as a scientist, and massive lefty, and massive pacifist, and she was Margaret Thatcher's tutor at university, and they actually had a very touching relationship their entire life, where they occasionally would write letters to each other and kind of have some sort of like affection and pride about each other. And so this guy wrote this quite nice play about it, but then the family of the scientist involved got really upset because they said that he had only done one-sided end of research. He'd looked at a lot of archives in the appropriate college in Oxford, but he hadn't gone and talked to the family, and there were other things that they hadn't put ahead. And so I think you have to do, especially with a living person, like you would for any documentary, you'd have to make sure your research was good. But some of it, then it's sort of working that out. You must have got colleagues who've done stuff on Turing and things who would have noticed this with some of the stuff around him.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are historical consultants just like there are science consultants for all of these things. And if you were doing a documentary, you would just tap into those historians. And I think the mistake people make with science documentaries is to think that we know all of that stuff, that it's all certain. I mean, there's lots of scientific debates going on. So in this case, you know, what was going on inside her head, we may not know for sure, but you can talk to historians and they say, well, we think this is going on. Same thing happens with science documentaries. We're not totally sure. Just ask a couple scientists and they say, well, we think this is it. And then it makes it on the screen that way.
Sorry. No. If you've got, you know, if you had 3 letters and no other correspondence, you could still tie it together as a factual documentary. You know, you just avoid absolute certainty in the wording. I wouldn't see it as a problem at all.
Is there a danger, though, with when you're making a film about a real person, where it does seem that once you've made the changes, that seems in the majority of people's minds, those who've seen it, to actually be the true version of events. Though even though we should look at each, I mean, I think of, though it's not a science film, for instance, Dallas Buyers Club, where there are various facts changed, and also I know various people who were quite angry about it because it made it look like the only guy who ever got involved with this was an ex-rodeo rider heterosexual, and there was no idea of the fact that was, you know, a very small example of actually what was going on around in the gay communities around in the USA. Or the submarine movie U-571 or whatever it's called, which kind of changes the history, and now that's kind of the official history. Or The Imitation Game, where I mean, I might be wrong, this may be entirely wrong, but I found it quite bizarre that there's a bunch of chess masters and mathematicians that are shocked that one of them seems to be poor socially. Surely they would have had other examples of slightly socially inept, you know. Oh, what is it about this mathematician means he's less gregarious than the rest of us? But I just want, you know, those changes, I think that's the worrying thing, where it becomes the official version of events because fewer people are going to the books and fewer people are actually going to, you know, the histories.
I guess that happens with science too, but maybe you're risking really upsetting people when it comes to history, particularly recent history. Like this granddaughter of, I really wish I could remember her name. She was an amazing scientist.
Can someone look this up? Has anyone, whoever's got, you know, the...
Dorothy Hodgkin, that's it. Thank goodness. Sorry. What's so bad? I remember Thatcher, not Hodgkin. Yeah, I remember Thatcher, not Hodgkin. I feel terrible. Anyway, yeah, Hodgkin's family felt really upset about it, and I felt quite, I felt bad for them that they had, they had to experience that. I think at the same time I support the writer. You know, I think he'd done a fair bit of research. There'd just had some, and I know as a historian you kind of worry about that even when you're writing things factually and you're showing your sources, and you can tell that it's a partial thing because you're a historian. There's a kind of gloss of fiction which can be more truthy, and maybe when you're talking about history, makes it a bit harder. I think people should go for it though. Things like Hedy Lamarr, and you know, if we can do it for Alan Turing, we can do it for her. And Frank Oppenheimer. And Frank Oppenheimer's already been... Actually, our Royal Shakespeare Company Oppenheimer movie, play, I think they suggest that Frank Oppenheimer's wife, they make the sort of reference to her being only a waitress. She did study economics at Berkeley. I don't think it's a bit unfair in terms of... But, you know, there's things like that already in there, so I think we can go with it.
Well, I think that Vin Diesel as Darwin, and I'm seeing Steven Seagal possibly as Alfred Russel Wallace. This is, again, going sorry, any other questions? I apologise to the audience, I keep getting to look out there. Has anyone got a question they'd like to? Well, again, going back to in terms of fictional films, and we were talking a little bit about ideas of conservation, of understanding climate change. Does Hollywood have any ability to play a decent role in that, or will we always have things like, you know, what was it called, The Day Before
The Day After Tomorrow?
Yeah, where...
Yeah, I mean, and Tom can speak to this in terms of documentary, and lots of people here can speak to it. I mean, getting a film made in Hollywood is very, very incredibly difficult. And scientists often come to me and say, well, how do I get them to make my film? It's like, well, stand in line. There's, you know, hundreds of potential people wanting to get their films made. I mean, the thing about The Day After Tomorrow is that it served its purpose in raising awareness about the issue. And I think the science is a bit funky, although it wasn't totally ludicrous. It was a legitimate hypothesis. I mean, the science advisor in the UK actually, that was one of the at the time, that was one of his favorite hypotheses, that it would be a global freeze, that global warming would lead to a global freeze. But the idea of it instantly freezing, all that stuff was really weird. But politically, it was actually really important. And you find lots of interviews with scientists at the time going, yeah, you know, it's a goofy movie, but thank God they did it because people weren't paying attention to this issue. And we want people to pay attention to the issue. And that's like a film like Contagion brings, you know, the notion of emerging viruses to people's attention. That's important. San Andreas, the film that just came out, I use a phrase in my book called the War Games effect, right? And essentially, these science consultants who work on these films, they're essentially playing like the ghost of Christmas future, right? They're essentially saying, look how horrible things will be unless you act now and change your life to make it so that that future doesn't come to pass, essentially. So they can't play a role in that way, and a very substantial role in raising awareness.
Well, is the War Game, actually thinking of the film, Peter Watkins' film, The War Game, which was the precursor to Threads, which was, you know, set in Sheffield, which that was unthinkable to actually put that on television for 20 years, was it, before that was actually shown? So,
has anyone seen that? Yeah. I'm still haunted by that.
It's fascinating though, isn't it? It's such a... all of his films, because they're done in that kind of documentary style. He's done an amazing one about Edward Munch as well, but that's less sciencey. A little bit more misogynist. Anyway, so thinking again about the unthinkable, in terms of Discovery Channel, because I find it a bit of a pity that there's this very upbeat, happy... What do you see when you're making a show? You go, oh, I thought we could get this in. What are the kind of bits of science which are most likely to not quite make the cut? You know, so not ideas that don't get made, but that moment where you go, at this point, we're worried that our subscriber is turning over to another channel.
We don't really work that way. We don't commission a project until we're pretty comfortable with where it's going. So, you know, a producer will come to us with an idea. If we like it, we'll work it up. Then, you know, if we're serious about it, we might do a little bit of development, pay them for, you know, 6 weeks to really flesh it out. And by the time we commission it, we'll know already if we have, you know, we won't, because commission it, if we're commissioning 6 hours, that's a serious commitment. So financially and time-wise, and, you know, in terms of thinking we've got those 6 hours coming down the pipeline, we just simply wouldn't go into them if we thought we had a problem. You know, in terms of science, the other way we do have to take risks in other ways. So, you know, an unthinkable project for us was, as I was mentioning earlier, Ed Stafford, Naked and Marooned, and yes, okay, it's a bit of a gimmicky title, but you know, Ed had always he walked the Amazon. Over 2 years, which we condensed into 2 hours. A lot happens. But then he said he'd always wanted to live on a desert island, you know, and so the challenge there was we don't know what's going to happen, so we had to take a risk on the fact that he might get sick, he might, you know, there weren't any, we made sure the island didn't have any deadly creatures on it, and it had fresh water, but you know, that was our sort of risk on that was part of the excitement of the project, was that risk, but we wouldn't go into something where we think the science here is going to scare our viewers. Is
currently, I mean, an idea that you would kind of like to exist, but is currently uncommissionable in this climate?
That's a really tricky one. I was trying, I sort of, before we came here, I've been trying to think of the idea that I wish we could commission, and that is the ongoing problem we have, you know, that's the exciting challenge we face, is you know, is what is the next big thing, and if I knew what I wanted to make but couldn't yet, I'd be in a really great position. But instead, you know, we are basically waiting for the, you know, that's what we rely on the independent production companies for, is to come to us with the amazing ideas, and then we can make them. You know, I'm not sort of sitting there with a bank of fantastic ideas that we can't make just now. I mean, I'd like to make international, you know, what do you call them, marionettes, the International Rescue...
Thunderbirds.
Thunderbirds. I'd like to find some people who really do what the Thunderbirds did. That would be an amazing show, full of engineering and jeopardy and excitement. But I don't have anything sitting in my drawer at work that I wish we could make. I have plenty of things that we're not going to make.
Because I'm often fascinated by what people were. I remember once doing a show about quantum cosmology. Don't worry, I didn't cover that bit of it. I'm an idiot. But it was like, at Glastonbury, where you have 3,000 people in a tent, listening to and you can hear slowly the cracking of their skulls as it's a beautiful thing to hear a mixture of hot cider, mushrooms and quantum cosmology. And it's interesting, I suppose, that sometimes I think we have presumptions that there are things that won't work. And I do understand, but so we've nearly run out of time, and have we got any more questions from the? Oh yes, no, you're saying yes, we have nearly run out of time. I'm sorry, you're in charge of this session. Talking about, I'm very interested in the science stories that you think will be good to be told that show. I mean, for instance, I was thinking of Philip Ball's book, Serving the Reich, which looks, for instance, at the physicists who worked for the Third Reich, the cognitive dissonance amongst them. We're just scientists, we're not really working for the Third Reich, and indeed some of whom were more active as Nazis. And that's a very interesting story where, in that example, there were certain scientists who said, oh no, it's just the science, we're not involved. And I think that kind of tell. I wondered if you had particular stories.
I'd just say that's not necessarily something of the past. It's very easy to tell. Often, actually, the baddies of science history get put in the past, and we say, "Oh, it's all good now." It's a classic form of way in which everybody who involves themselves in the history of science ends up doing this. And professional historians of science will shake their head at such evilness and won't do anything so bad. Obviously, themselves, they're clean of these things because we're always, we all think that we're clean of these things. But yeah, I think it's very easy to say, oh, that these people in the past did that, or the scientists under some particular ideology that we have shaken off did that. But we have them today. I do quite a lot of work about, I do some campaigning against the arms trade, and so I often talk to scientists who have got some involvement with that, and say, how do you reconcile this with other parts of your life? Or, for example, one of our main science education projects, one of our big main science education festivals every year for children is called the Big Bang Fair. Big Bang, exciting. Sponsored by BAE Systems. Makes a lot of big bangs. And so I've done a bit of campaigning about kind of so some people would disagree with me on that, that's fine, but I at least want the idea that some of us disagree with it existing to be out there, and I've talked to scientists about how they feel about that, and they go, well, I obviously don't like cluster bombs, but some of the science they do is terribly interesting. All right, okay, and maybe that's true, but I think as a society and the scientific community itself should talk about that and realise that maybe some of this, I'm just doing the science, isn't of the past. So those are the sort of things, maybe those tensions, which aren't necessarily a goody and baddie story. And I don't think any scientist ever a really goody or baddie. Most people, they're human, Bringing out some of that subtlety is what I'd like to see more of. Obviously, not all documentaries are going to be able to do that, or films, or radio shows.
That is definitely the intention with the new project I'm working on is to not just it's not just looking at the subject matter of the science. It's sort of looking out at its impact on the world, and and the scientists that are doing it, and what they're going through in order to do it. So it's not that kind. It is definitely much more of seeing the full picture.
You've got the people.
You've got the people. Yeah, absolutely, and that will be the way into all the stories. As we're almost casting the best. We're not looking for characters in a drama kind of way, but we're not just saying, okay, we're going to make something about this project because it's amazing. We're like, okay, well, that's an amazing project, but we need the characters because that's the only way we're really going to care about it, and trying to make sure that, we, for our purposes, we cover the whole globe, so we have the full international spectrum as well. So hopefully, I'm hoping with that series that we will sort of get into slightly more philosophical territory than we're perhaps currently known for.
See, the BA Systems thing as well, I think is very interesting, because I remember when the letter from last year, and I remember sending it around to a bunch of scientists I knew, and almost none of them, I think 2 out of 40 scientists signed it. Because the rest went, yeah, but it's just kind of the way it is. Yeah, I think that's a very, because I personally don't, I think I signed it as far as I remember, and it was because it does seem to be a problem which isn't necessarily taken on board, and that's...
The scientists who had good defence, they had their own defence they thought through. I was like, well, fair dues, we disagree, but it was... Yeah, we didn't really talk about it.
But that's a very good documentary. I'll tell you, I'm going to make that one. I'd love to. So let's end with, for all 3 of you, the unthinkable project that you have in something that you would like to, or indeed, it doesn't have to be something that you were going to make, but something that you would like to see, some idea of science that you would like to see thrown into popular culture. And it's a tough one, isn't it?
I'd like to see a documentary of the mid-20th century history of climate change science, with all the people who thought they were funded by the military to work out how to nuke the North Pole so that they'd flood Russia and stuff, and how that led to us understanding about like tree hugging things like climate change. I'd like to see that.
Yeah, I mean, oh God. I mean, I think one of the things I'd like to see tackled differently, and not necessarily in terms of making it seem like a good thing, but I think the ways in which movies have dealt with genetic engineering have been really, in some ways, kind of lame. Because I think the ways in which that technology will move over the next 50 or 100 years, not the next 10, 20, you're going to have some really crazy things happening with that technology that I think movies just deal with at a simple level. That it will change biology in ways that we can't imagine, and movies just aren't imagining it. Really.
Very cerebral. I'd like to see something that finally puts to bed whether dinosaurs were warm or cold-blooded.
Well, that's one of the beautiful things about when you watch older documentaries and you see the constant changes in understanding. When you see what dinosaurs look like in a 1972 documentary, when you pick up a copy of Look and Learn and it says, we still don't know how dinosaurs became extinct, and then later they go, now we do, and then, now we've returned to, and now it's up in the, that's a beautiful thing.
Exactly, you read something every year and you think, hadn't we, so we need to settle that debate. Watch this space.
Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much for coming down, and let's have a round of applause for all of them.